And it's about a century since Banting and Best discovered the molecular basis of type 1 diabetes, that in some unfortunate children and a few unfortunate adults, there is autoimmune destruction of the islets of Langerhans in the pancreas, and the ability of that inflamed pancreas to secrete insulin is impaired. And so the energy economy of the patient's body is severely altered. It's a single small dipeptide linked with disulfide bonds. It's synthesized as a single chain and then cleaved. And very quickly it was realized that you could supply this hormone to patients with type 1 diabetes. And there was optimism that you could rescue this formerly fatal phenotype. And so a century later, I would argue that this disease that arises from a deficiency really of a single polypeptide is not a solved problem. We see diabetic heart disease, we see diabetic neuropathy, we see diabetic kidney disease, we see patients with overwhelming infections in the context of diabetes. Is there a parrot watching me?
It's a lovebird. Yeah, he's a very popular member of the course here. Perhaps
as long as the owl doesn't alarm him, we're
students.
fine. I certainly approved of feathered companions. And so if indeed we have a very complicated and still lethal phenotype from an illness caused by deficiency of a single peptide, what then do we make of uremia? This is a very crude chart that's probably now a half a century old of the consequences of renal failure. I think there's probably another 2 pages of chart now. Such modern ideas as FGF23, for example, are not part of this chart. And so I would argue that we shouldn't be shocked that patients whose kidneys have failed are ill. And that's the challenge that we're trying to address in my laboratory, is mitigating the suffering that arises when a vital organ has failed, and our remedy for that to date has been disappointing. Now, Kim will tell you, and maybe you all know this as well, that nephrology has had a fair amount of optimism over the years. I've been a kidney doctor for about 20 years. And around the time that I started my nephrology fellowship, maybe even a little bit before, when I was wrapping up medical school or I was wrapping up residency maybe, we were starting to learn the molecular basis for some classic diseases in nephrology. So polycystic kidney disease is the most common monogenic form of renal failure. Peter Harris identified a single gene located, whose protein product is located on the central cilium of tubule cells in the renal medulla. When this gene is damaged, there's uncontrolled proliferation of cells forming cysts that eventually occupy enough space that the kidney fails. And for those of you who've never seen a patient with polycystic kidney disease, These can be kilograms and kilograms of weight. They can be so large that the patient cannot take a deep breath. The patient does not have room in their abdomen for food and cannot eat in severe cases. And so this is now what, 25 years ago, there was an optimism that this was now a solved problem, that we now knew the genetic basis for this horrifying disease, and therefore progress would ensue. Similarly, we know that patients whose kidneys leak protein into the urine are the patients who are at highest risk of progression to kidney failure. And right around the time I started my nephrology fellowship, Carl Tryggvason identified a key gene whose protein product is the main constituent of the molecular sieve that retains plasma proteins in blood and lets small molecules escape into the urine. And again, there was optimism that we now had a handle on the cause of disease. So where did a quarter century take us? Well, I was in clinic last week and I had a patient with polycystic kidney disease, creatinine at 2 and a GFR of 40. And I had absolutely not a thing to offer that patient other than a repurposed cardiovascular drug and a promise that I would get them ready for dialysis when the day came. We have patients who have catastrophic nephrotic syndrome in our clinic, patients whose kidneys are leaking protein, who are progressing to kidney failure. And despite these insights about the podocyte slit diaphragm and nephrin, all I have to offer them is a repurposed cardiovascular drug. In a few unfortunate patients with autoimmune disease, I may offer them a cancer chemotherapy drug. But at the end of the day, there really is not a blessed thing different in our management of these patients from 20 years ago to today. And so this optimism that the toolkit of molecular biology was going to unveil the fundamental mechanisms of disease and unleash the power of industry to invent and market cures was possibly premature. The consequences of that are obvious. We have a huge number of patients who require some kind of help. We would love to be able to implement the idea that if you're missing a vital organ, the best treatment is another vital organ. But kidney transplant then and now is limited by the scarcity of donor organs. We have over 100,000 candidates on the transplant wait list in the United States, and we perform about 20,000 transplants a year. The ESRD population in the United States now is probably approaching 600,000 patients on dialysis, maybe a hair less, and maybe 100,000 people who have transplants. That disparity is really because patients with transplants live for 20 years and patients on dialysis live for 5 years. So the 600,000 patients on dialysis has a lot of churn to it. 100,000 new starts a year, 100,000 deaths a year. Whereas the number of patients with a kidney transplant, maybe 120,000 patients, that's 20,000 additions and 20,000 deaths a year. And it's growing. This is a growth business. Netflix or Walmart would love to have business growth of 8% per year, year on year for a quarter century. And there's not a whole lot of sign of slowing down either. Hate to say it. We saw a little dent in the curve That's probably a delayed effect of the introduction of angiotensin receptor blockers, a repurposed cardiovascular drug, into this space. But every year we have more and more and more and more patients coming in our door. And since transplant is limited by scarcity, patients are offered the opportunity to die or the opportunity to undergo a repeated procedure to try to remove waste products and excess fluid so that they don't die as a consequence of the failure of their vital organ, kidney. So what is dialysis? Hemodialysis is the predominant form of dialysis done in the United States. It's kind of the default. Canada, it may be a little bit different. There may be a little bit more peritoneal dialysis, and the style in which it's done may differ. But fundamentally, blood gets pumped from the patient's body to a filter that's about the size of 2 beer cans stacked on end. It passes through this filter. On the other side of a semi-permeable membrane, salt solution is circulated, and small molecules diffuse out of blood into that electrolyte solution called dialysate. Some molecules like base equivalents, acetate, bicarbonate, lactate, what have you, diffuse from the dialysate into the patient's blood to buffer dietary acid loads. And then under the power of hydrostatic pressure, salt water is forced through the membrane to balance the fluid intake that the patient has consumed since the last time they got dialysis. In the US, this is typically done 3 times a week for a series of hours at a time. And it's that intermittent nature of dialysis that causes no shortage of heartache. So if we're removing wastes, and choose the waste of your choice, creatinine, urea, this, that, something else. If it's dependent on dialysis, then it's dependent on diffusion. And diffusion is the thermodynamic movement of molecules down a concentration gradient. You've got to remove 2 days of dietary intake, a couple hours, because, hey, we got to get you out of here, get the next guy in. And so you're kind of stuck in the middle. In order to excrete that mass of waste, you need a big concentration gradient between blood and dialysate. So you need a high concentration of wastes in your blood to drive the removal. But high concentrations of wastes make you sick. So intoxication with waste products is intrinsic to how we perform dialysis today. We mitigate much of that by starving the patient, by telling the patient, don't eat too much potassium, don't eat too much phosphorus, stay away from salt. But at the end of the day, the patient starts out their career on dialysis walking along a wide, elevated pathway that subsequently narrows to a balance beam and then finally to a tightrope, with one side starvation and the other side intoxication. And then the tightrope narrows down to nothing and the patient dies. How about fluid volume? All you Edmontonians, hard drinkers up there? Popping the bottle back?
No, not very much.
Well, if you have renal failure and you're dependent on dialysis, you're supposed to be a fairly frugal with your fluid intake. Because if we're only doing dialysis 3 times a week, We've got to get rid of a couple days worth of trouble in one go. See, there you go, tipping the bottle back. Exactly. You gonna show us the brand? What is that? That 80 proof water? Swell. Excellent. So if you just do a little math, Dr. Solis has left to get a refill at the bar. Suppose you're a dutiful patient and you only drink 1.5 liters a day, which if you're a diabetic and you're hyperosmolar and it's driving your thirst center, and thirst is very difficult to ignore, is probably a heroic demand on the patient. But suppose you're a good patient and you only drink 1.5 liters a day. Well, that's 7 days a week. That's 10.5 liters a week. We're going to divide that up and pull it off in 3 sessions. That's 3.5 liters per session. Your circulating blood volume is only 6 liters, and 1/3 of that is red blood cells. So we need to slurp out 3.5 liters of water out of 4 liters of plasma water in a couple hours. How do you think that's going to go? So every single dialysis patient experiences cyclic volume overload in the hours leading up to dialysis, followed by hypovolemic shock 156 times a year. And so Chris McIntyre, who's at Western Ontario now, really good nephrology center in Canada, really documented that this process where the fluid overload drives cardiac hypertrophy, the pathognomic cardiac lesion of dialysis. So you've got a big, beefy heart muscle that's demanding blood flow to feed it. And then you suddenly pull fluid out of the patient, their heart rate goes up, the duration of diastole goes down, diastolic filling of the calcified coronary arteries falls. You get regional wall motion abnormalities just like an MI. And you do that 156 times a year. How do you think that works? Should we be shocked that there's 16% mortality per year in hemodialysis? I would argue that yes, we should be shocked that it's only 16% per year. We would possibly expect it to be more given the panoply of metabolic abnormalities that we see. Ben Burton was the first director of the Artificial Kidney Chronic Uremia program at NIDDK. These were the heady days of technological optimism. Pacemakers were just becoming mainstream. Dialysis was starting to become a standard of care rather than a heroic procedure that required the meeting of ethics committees to decide if this patient was a valuable enough Homo sapiens sapiens to deserve the scarce resource of a dialysis machine. I am sufficiently old enough that I've sat on one of those ethics committees, as it were. It was pro forma. We would discuss the patient and rubber stamp it, but it was still a vestige of an earlier era. Ben Burton, 1976, Kim.
Yep.
We're worried that dialysis is going to get institutionalized, and satisfied with what we'd wrought in this field, we'll pile small improvements on top of other minor advances in dialysis technology, and ultimately the technology of ESRD therapy will become entrapped in its own net for failure to break out in new directions. Kim, who gave me this quote?
I don't know.
3 guesses. The first 2 don't count.
Bob Schreier. I don't know.
David Humes.
David Humes. Okay.
And he got it from Mike Lysak.
Okay.
So the back when God was a kid, ambulances had square wheels and we used Flint IVs, and I was an emergency medical technician in Boston before I went to medical school while I was a college dropout. I would take patients from their homes to the kidney center on Com Ave, and that was 1987. The only difference between the dialysis unit of 1987 and the dialysis unit of 2020 is what? Any ideas? Patients are all watching flat screen TVs today. That's the only difference. It's still a hollow fiber dialyzer. It's still dialyzing to a KT over V of 1.2. Everything else has been entrapped in its own net and failed to break out in new directions. And as Kim mentioned, the nephrology community has not been welcoming of new directions for a variety of reasons. But we're kind of last in our class. When I was an advanced life support paramedic, I would find patients at home who were having chest pain or having cardiac arrhythmias. And if they had successfully survived their arrhythmia, they would get admitted to hospital. Some old dude with a beard would juggle their meds while somebody would be paid minimum wage to watch the squiggly line on the television and holler if it changed. That was the state of the art in cardiac rhythm management when I started medical school. Today, automated signal processing algorithms can recognize a malignant cardiac rhythm. They are implemented in these kind of funny yellow boxes that are in casinos and airplanes and probably in your school. And they will allow an 8-year-old child to be a good enough cardiologist to successfully diagnose and treat the leading cause of out-of-hospital death in the industrialized world. I think that's a remarkable achievement. And then low power microcircuitry and high energy density batteries have allowed us to package those same algorithms and interventions inside a little titanium can that sits resident in the patient's anterior chest wall, standing sentinel over them 24/7, 365, diagnosing and treating the leading cause of out-of-hospital death in the industrialized world without any human intervention at all. So what in 1988 consisted of me finding somebody dead in the shower now consists of somebody calling their cardiologist's office and saying, hey, the thing zapped me last night while I was in the shower. Do I need to come in? It's really remarkable. We've seen a migration from clinic-based, caregiver-centered care delivery on the left to penetration into the community in the middle and implementation inside the patient's own body on the right. How are we doing? Dialysis land. On the left, you've got Colf's first Colf Brigham artificial kidney, Archimedean screw of sausage casings moved blood along the blood conduit, splooshing in and out of this bucket, this wash basin of electrolyte solution. Anyone know what the problem was? What the technological barrier that Colf had to overcome was? Anyone know? Kim, do you know? It was the swivel fitting for the blood because that thing is spinning.
Yeah.
And the blood has to get from something that's spinning to something that's not, because patients don't like spinning. We've had community-based dialysis in the home ever since walnut pattern Formica was trendy. 0.5% of the US dialysis population chooses home hemodialysis as their preferred therapy. It's not hard to understand that. It takes a certain amount of intestinal fortitude to jam needles in your arm and duct tape them down and hope that nothing bad happens. Principal reason why patients stop home hemodialysis is caregiver burnout. You can see how that would work. Hey, hon, can you stick the needles in tonight? I'm tired. But if you screw it up, I'm going to go to the hospital tonight. I'm going to get a dialysis catheter, and I'm likely to die of catheter-related bacteremia. No pressure, but will you put the needles in me tonight? You can see how this works out. And then once the needles are in, it's like, all right, I'm going to go to sleep. You stay up, make sure nothing bad happens. This is the consequence of moving a technology that was designed to be applied by trained professionals into the home and hoping that you can somehow get the caregiver at home to assume the role of professional medical staff. The box on the right is stunningly empty. There's no version of the AICD for kidney. And so many people have claimed that I've discarded a promising career and wasted my diminished intellect on this project. But this is our goal, is to make a universal donor kidney, to make a device that will deliver enough continuous clearance of waste products and of water so that those two pressure points that I outlined before, the high concentrations of wastes and the roller coaster ride of fluid balance, are mitigated. Now, we're not the first people to have this idea. There's wonderful pictures of Pim McAuliffe in the Alps in a VW microbus with a portable dialysis machine. Kim, I think you know Eli Friedman.
Yes.
Who I believe is still with us, who had commissioned, I think out of his own pocket, a portable dialysis machine and would take patients to dialysis camp and dialyze them out in the woods in California, get them away from the city for a while. But there's really a couple barriers to miniaturization implantation. First is the dialyzer itself. Now, we've progressed a little bit since then. I don't know. I usually have a prop with me here in the office. Forgive me. Let me see if I can find. Do you all know what a dialyzer looks like? Let me see if I can find one. Hang on. I should have one somewhere. Kidneys for Bill. Let's see.
What psychologists tell us is moments like these where the audience is waiting for something is much more memorable than a presentation without such moments. So
this is an old school dialyzer. It's a F40 by Fresenius. It's smaller than the ones we use today. The ones we use today are kind of more thermos sized. This is actually a relic of David Hume's RAD trials. You can see it says sham RAD, not for human use on it. But this little hollow fiber dialyzer, number one, it's hard to imagine what body cavity is it going to fit in and what orifice is it going to pass through to get there. Where are we getting the 300 millimeters of hydrostatic pressure that's necessary to force blood, this colloid that's viscous, through the bundle of little 100 micron hollow fibers that makes up this dialyzer? I don't have 300 millimeters of mercury pressure handy within me anywhere to do that pushing unless I sneeze. So that's one problem, is the dialyzer. Second problem is the dialysate. So every dialysis unit has a water room. Every dialysis treatment burns through 200 and some liters of ultra pure water. I can't carry that around with me. That's a barrier to miniaturization. So starting almost 20 years ago, while other people were getting all excited about their Western blots of various plasma, various proteins related to renal disease, we considered renal physiology. And we asked ourselves, well, do we need to follow the plan of dialysis? How do kidneys work inside? Well, your paired kidneys get in aggregate about 1.5 liters a minute of blood flow. 1,700 liters a day flows through your kidneys. 10% of that, 8% of that plasma water passes through the kidneys filter. 140 liters a day, maybe. And that is a very dilute solution of all the different stuff in your blood: sugar, amino acids, waste products, creatinine, all kinds of little odds and ends. And then that filtrate passes over a lawn of tubule cells, each one of which individually has a repertoire of apical membrane transporters that pull back all the stuff you need. One SGLT2 pulls back the sugar, NHE3 pulls back the salt and kicks out protons. The mates, oats, OCATs pull back amino acids. And at the end of that bioreactor of epithelial cells, of which there's 1 million in each, million little bioreactors in each one of your kidneys, that 140 liters a day has been concentrated down to the 1.5 to 2 liters a day that you pee in the toilet bowl. So we went from 1,700 liters a day of blood flow to 1.7 liters a day of yellow juice that you pee out. And you concentrated the wastes from the 140 liters that you filtered to the 1.7 liters that you pee out, that you can just replace with oral intake. That's the key reason for the concentration. Fish don't have to do that. Right, Kim?
Yep.
Fish have pretty stupid tubules because it's not hard for a fish to drink as much as needed to replace renal excretion of toxins. So we asked ourselves, well, look at, okay, this is a pretty simplistic view of the world, but can we do this? Can we copy this approach to renal engineering? And so the cells that make up the kidney's filters are damaged in almost all the renal disease that results in renal failure. 95% of it. Is that fair, Kim?
Yes.
And we don't know how to grow them in a dish in a way that they assume the same shape and structure and function in a dish as they do inside a human body. I can't grow a filter today, but maybe, just maybe, we can build a filter that we don't know how to grow. On the other hand, in the lower part, these are renal tubule cells. These are the cells that do the taking back the salt and the water and the amino acids and make a choice to not reabsorb waste products. And in fact, I torment the renal fellows and the residents sometimes by asking them, what's the molecule that makes you sick in renal failure? What's the molecule that causes cognitive dysfunction, accelerated atherosclerotic cardiac disease, disruption of the neuromuscular junctions such that patients with uremia cannot sustain muscle tone? What is the molecule that makes their pulmonary vasculature leaky and gives them uremic lung of pulmonary edema? Does anyone know what that molecule is? Take a stab, take a guess.
Middle molecules.
Well, I would argue that Dr. Soles knows, but he knows not up in his cerebral cortex, he knows down in his renal cortex, because those kidney cells discriminate between what's healthy and what's not, but we don't know as a species the molecular identities of the molecules that cause the clinical syndrome of uremia. So I cannot build a sorbent system, a filter, a meshwork that will select a metabolically valuable substrate and reject a uremic toxin. I don't have the knowledge base to do that. Nobody does. But we can possibly grow an epithelial cell bioreactor so that we can grow a Santa Claus membrane that knows what molecules have been naughty and what molecules have been nice, and achieve that ourselves. And there's a second win, by the way. This little kind of Bill Fissell, Renal Physiology, all this transport here is happening by means of chemical energy of ATP. It's not happening with wires and electrical induction motors and tubing. It's not happening with batteries. It's happening with biology. So the second advantage to using cells is that it liberates us from needing a conventional electrical power supply with batteries and wires and drive lines. So now you know what the rest of the talk's going to be, right? We're going to talk about the filter, and then we're going to talk about the bioreactor. Okay, so on the left, this is a hollow fiber dialyzer. This is about 100 microns in diameter. It's made from polymers. It's produced using a polymer demixing process where two polymers that are semi-miscible are spun into a hollow fiber, and then one congeals, solidifies, changes phase, and becomes immiscible with the other. And the other creates the voids that create the pores in the filter. Typically, this is a change in temperature, a change in pH, a change in salinity. Something like that drives the condensation of the one polymer and the demixing from the other polymer. You can see these pores are kind of round. They're irregular shaped. They're irregular sized. They look like a kitchen sponge. On the right, on the upper right, this thing that looks like an octopus gone mad, or in honor of, do y'all Canadians have Halloween?
Yep.
Okay. This thing kind of looks like a spider. It's getting over Halloween night. That's a renal podocyte. And the filter is this little slot. I don't know, can you see my mouse on the screen?
Yes.
Okay. This little slot shape here is the filtration unit that separates the blood inside this capillary from the filter, from the filtrate. It's like the cells wrap around the capillary like this, and the filtration happens in these little slits in between adjacent cell processes. In a transmission EM on the bottom, you can see that that's cutting them little fingers like that. They're kind of all the same distance from each other. 20 nanometer, 20 nanometer, 20 nanometer, 20 nanometer. So our best polymer substitute has these irregularly sized round holes, and our kidney has regularly sized slits. And then if you look around in nature, you'll find this now, that where nature has evolved pressure-driven filtrations like the baleen plates of filter-feeding whales, this is a humpback whale, there's slits. Where engineers have filters, such as a cunningly contrived storm drain to trap bicycle wheels, organized parallel with the stream of traffic, that blocks big things from falling in, there's slots. So now I hope that I've infected you with this meme, and you're going to go through life looking at slots. Why is that? Is it important in guiding us what we're going to do? Well, so I went to Andrew Zidney, who is the chair of chemical engineering at Penn State, and I asked him this question, and he knew an idiot when he saw one. And he said, well, Bill, have you ever cooked pasta? I was like, yeah. And I said, okay, so it's dinner time. You're hungry. You've got a pot full of pasta and you want to make that into dinner. And so there's kind of two things on your mind when you carry that pasta over to the colander in the sink. One is, oh my gosh, this is hot and I'm going to get burned if we don't get this over with soon. And the other is, I'm hungry and I really don't want these noodles going down the drain. And every single filtration process is a trade-off between permeability, getting the noodles in the strainer before your hands burn, and selectivity, not letting the noodles go down the drain. And I don't care if you're making cheese or if you're making RO water, it's all the same. And so Sydney compared the performance of membranes of slit pores in the solid line to membranes of round pores in the dashed line from first principles analysis, purely math, and compared membranes where pores were all the same size to membranes where the pores had a dispersion of pore sizes. And lo and behold, for any selectivity, the slot-shaped pores that were uniform in size had the best permeability. And for any permeability, it was the slot-shaped pores where the membrane's pores were all the same size that had the best selectivity. So maybe nature evolved slot-shaped pores and the baleen plates of filter-feeding whales and the beaks of filter-feeding birds like flamingos for a reason, because it optimizes this trade-off between permeability and selectivity that's intrinsic to all separations processes. So all we did, the only innovation that I made, was to change the technology we use to make membranes from the solvent demixing process of the polymer spinning plant to silicon nanotechnology like we use for your phone. Okay, somebody whose video is showing has a phone in front of them. Hold up a phone, one of y'all. One of you's gonna hold up the lovebird, the other one's gonna hold up a phone. You got a phone there? Nobody's got a phone that they can wave around at all?
Joel has one. And
wow.
Kaylin.
I mean, down here in the States, you give a lecture, everybody, you just see the tops of heads because everybody's looking at their phones. Here, I get to see faces for once. Your phone has a little mechanical device in it inside an integrated circuit chip that's an accelerometer that can sense gravity. That's how your phone knows which way is up. The silicon micromachining toolkit allows you to make extraordinarily precise mechanical devices at very low unit cost, using the same toolkit that the microelectronics industry evolved for integrated circuits. And so here's one of our early membranes. They're flat sheet membranes because that's how we get wafers. This is an en face view. If you look at very high power, this is a piece of silicon. This is a pore. This is another piece of silicon. This is another pore. This is another piece of silicon. There are these elongated slots, and when you snap the membrane and you look at it in cross section, where here's the top of the membrane, here's the bottom of the membrane, you can see these pores are very uniform in size. They're all 7 nanometers. They're smooth inside. Nothing's going to get hung up on them. So we've made something that looks a little bit more like this than like this. And we were told countless times by NIH study sections that refused to fund us that you could never, ever make a hemofilter membrane out of silicon, because silicon dioxide, sand, clay, silica, is the one material on planet Earth that is guaranteed to make blood clot. We made every argument in the sun, and we didn't get very far. But what we did get far doing was employing a library of hydrated polymers to block the access of blood to the surface so that we can now implement these silicon chips in a blood circuit. And you can see here this little meniscus of filtrate that came through the silicon chip to make an ultrafiltrate just like a glomerulus. And using a variety of technology tools that I'll spare you the details of, but which cost us a king's ransom, we now are able to make cartridges that we can sew into experimental animals and that generate an ultrafiltrate of plasma under the driving pressure of the animal's heart alone. No electrical induction motor driven pumps. We spent an enormous amount of money designing the cartridge. I don't know if you can see this here in the little picture.
Yep.
The blood conduit, so the blood does not clot. These animals are not receiving systemic anticoagulation. And they will filter for weeks on end, just wandering around in the animal facility. No drugs, no warfarin, no heparin, no clot. So we've moved things from the concept I had in 1999 that shifting the toolkit we used to make membranes could be fundamentally enabling for an implanted device that could operate autonomously within the human body without any pumps or wires or hoses or connectors. And we've done that against a background of opposition, of people saying that we can't. For 1,000 reasons, we can't. And yet, we have. So let's move to the second part of this project, the bioreactor part of this project. This part here. We made one of these out of silicon chips. You can imagine when I was interviewing for nephrology fellowships, it's like, yes, I want to make an artificial kidney out of silicon chips. They looked at me with the same kind of amused indulgence that you might accommodate a homeless person in a tinfoil hat defending his gum wrappers on the subway. I mean, these people had no idea what to do with me. If I had told them that my career goal was to become an anteater, they would have been less surprised, I assure you. So let's think about this part, okay? So on the left, this is a renal tubule epithelial cell. This is from Heptonstall's pathology. For all I know, Dr. Soles took this picture himself. If you did, sorry, I'll send you the nickel royalties. It's a really glorious cell. It has this luxurious kelp bed of cilia extending from its apical surface, multiplying the surface area of the top of the cell several thousand-fold. It's packed with mitochondria, these dark blobs, the power plants of the cell generating the ATP that basolateral sodium potassium ATPase requires to eject sodium out the bottom side of the cell. You can't see it here in great detail. Maybe you can see a little hint of this. I don't know, does it project that there's a little line right here?
Yep.
Another little line, another little line. There's a brush border on the bottom of the cell too, extending into the cell. Invaginations, such that the basolateral membrane is positioned exactly next to all of these mitochondria, so that the sodium potassium ATPase is positioned right next to the power plant that makes the ATP. Now, you take the cell out of the person and you throw it in a dish, and it magically becomes this. Not very much of a brush border. If this was on a podocyte, Kim would tell you that this is microvillus transformation in response to stress. He would not be arguing to you that this is a brush border, I don't think. The irony of me, of all people, presenting to a world-renowned renal pathologist on pathology is stunning.
It's okay.
Um,
We're not uncomfortable if you're not.
Well, then I failed. My job is to make you uncomfortable, right? Isn't that the job of the what's that called? Isn't that the job of the press? To make the secure uncomfortable and to reassure the insecure and to comfort the insecure.
From today onward, we don't know exactly what the press is supposed to do.
Yeah.
Everything changes today.
So there's some vacuoles here. I don't know, Kim, what would you call those? Lysosomes, something? There's stuff in here that you see a few organized ones up here, but this looks messy. I'll give you $1 if you can point to a mitochondrion in here. Maybe here, I don't know. They're kind of flat. I mean, if you were going, what's the supermarket in Edmonton?
Safeway.
Right, you're going to Safeway to buy a kidney cell. Which one would you choose?
One on the left.
Yeah, shocker, right? But the moment you put the cell in the dish, you get this. And I don't think Dr. Soles related this to you, but I'm a recovering physicist. I'm on like step 2 of the 12-step program for physics. And I am not a biologist. And when I ask people who are biologists about this, I get this song and dance about developmental biology and all these acronyms that I don't understand, and SOX and homeobox this and that and the other thing. And I just said, this is just too much. My brain does not work this way. I am a linear thinker. I get from A to B to C. I can't think about pathways where one gene product has 26 binding partners, that each of them have 14 binding partners that all feed back to the first one. And it's just, my brain doesn't work that way. But what I can do is write down on a piece of paper the difference between me and a hunk of plastic. My wife is surprised that there's differences, but there are. If you look at a healthy kidney, it's kind of floppy, right? Anyone hold a kidney in their hand ever? Why did you have a kidney in your hand? Were you feeding it to your lovebird? Were you chopping it up to make steak and kidney pie?
No, it was in a biology class.
Okay. So it's pretty floppy, right? It's not as floppy as breast tissue or muscle tissue because it's in a capsule. So it's a little stiffer, but it's nowhere near the megapascal stiffness of a plastic dish. It's got fluid flowing over it all the time, but we just put the dish in the incubator and let it sit there. Inside me, there's insulin at about 70 picomoles. I hope it's not too much higher. Glucose is probably 80 milligrams per deciliter. But because I can't pay Rachel Evans enough money to have her sitting here changing media every 2 seconds, we overload the media to guard against exhaustion. There's 1,000,000 times as much insulin in the media as there is in me. There's 3-4 times as much glucose in the media as there is in me. And if the leading cause of renal failure is diabetes and we're overloading these cells with glucose and insulin, should we be surprised that they're unhappy? You all are familiar with the Warburg hypothesis, the idea that cancer cells rely on glycolysis and not oxidative phosphorylation so that they can divert carbon backbones to the synthesis of new DNA and the synthesis of new cell. Well, cells in the dish tend to be glycolytic. They don't tend to use oxidative phosphorylation. This is why there's not a ton of mitochondria here, because they're not interested in mitochondria right now. So all I did, my linear thinker self, was I just made this list. And I said, let's see, do any of these matter? And lo and behold, the Cialis ad was correct. Substrate stiffness, rigidity, had an overwhelming impact on the morphologic phenotype of these cells. When you grew these cells on a stiff-ish substrate, you saw this lacy network of intercellular junctions enclosing nuclei, this sort of tessellated pattern. And this is what we all grew up thinking this was good cell culture, right? We could see it. You can see each one. Each one's got its O1. It's like it's doing good. But there's nothing in me that looks like that. Not a chance. But if you grow these cells on substrates, this is polyacrylamide. This is nothing sexy. On substrates that have a Young's modulus, a bulk modulus that approximates healthy kidney tissue, you get spheres, you get cysts. You even get little tubule-looking things. And they aren't grown in it, they're grown on it. This is not so-called 3D culture, whatever that is. We repeated it on Matrigel that we'd stiffened with glutaraldehyde, a crosslinker, and native Matrigel. Native Matrigel is about 0.5 kilopascal, and the stiffened Matrigel is somewhere around 30. So it looks like it really is the stiffness, not just the chemical nature of the substrate. So we were pretty happy that we had found a knob that we could turn that changed the reception. Now the question was, does this matter at all? I mean, contrast this to, most of the grants and the papers that you've seen where there's Western blot after Western blot after Western blot. This is, the NIH thought this was just like kids in a sandbox. And so we compared plastic to stiff to soft substrates. This column, and this column. And we grew them for a pretty standard period of time, 10 days post-confluence. And we saw nothing. This was a day of weeping for me because the very transporters that we need to move salt and water for the functional identity of these cells as tubule cells was doing nothing. And if there's one thing in the world, Kim, you can ask Jim Burdick this. There's one thing in the world that I'm good at, it's sitting on my ass and doing nothing. And so I just ignored the world for a while. And then Rachel Evans, the cell culture tech who works for me, said to me, Bill, are we ever going to do anything with those cells? They're still in the incubator. I was like, what cells? What are you talking about? She says, the renal tubule cells that we seeded on the soft and stiff substrates a month ago. I was like, well, it ain't going to be anything, but go ahead and, get the lysates and we'll see. And lo and behold, if you just sat on your butt and did nothing and gave them some time, the cells on the soft substrate started expressing the transporters that are essential to the identity of the cell, whereas the cells on the stiff substrate out at 4 weeks did not. This is serendipity only. This is the value of benign neglect. And so then we went on, we looked at, again, the mRNA expression, we examined it by Western blot, we examined it by indirect immunofluorescence, and everywhere we looked, there was more NHE3. Pretty cool. Just don't hurry. Let the cells grow a little bit. This is counter to everything that you're ever taught, right? Your investigators teaching you, get this done, get her done, get the paper out. You can't culture them. They've been in culture for 10 days. Go, get your blots. No, just sit on your hands a little bit. Let's just see what happens. So then the next question was, does this affect their function at all? Does this matter? I mean, yeah, okay, we got pretty pictures, we got plots. And sure enough, the apical basal transport by these cells, the controls. Hey, where's my slides? Where'd it go? Take a step back for a second. I apologize, I jumped. These are grown on soft gels, but the gels aren't water permeable. So I can't measure transport growing on the gel. So in a series of steps that I'm blowing past because we're already at an hour and a minute and you guys are getting tired. We sought molecular pathways that are influenced by substrate stiffness, mechanotransductive pathways. We identified TGF-beta signaling as one of those pathways, and we treated cells with TGF-beta inhibitor. The legends are gone here. With metformin. Remember I said that thing about glycolytic versus oxidative phosphorylation? We just figured we'll treat them with a diabetes drug. What the hell? There's no science behind it. I'm just throw it on there. Or both. And so lo and behold, when we interrupted the mechanotransductive pathway with the TGF-beta inhibitor, transport went up, the black bars. When we coerced the cells into energizing oxidative phosphorylation by driving AMP kinase phosphorylation up with metformin, transport went up. And when we did both, transport went up even more, from 14 to 140. We looked to see whether the oncotic gradient mattered, and it didn't really change things that much. And when we blocked sodium potassium ATPase, the active pump that's doing the transport with a drug called Wabane, transport dropped dramatically. So it's not just that we made a leaky membrane. We didn't just make a membrane with holes in it. We actually have active apical basotransport by these cells in a dish. So we were told again and again by study sections that we were destined to failure because cells in culture don't transport. This is not high science, right? Bill Fissell writing down the differences between Bill Fissell and a hunk of plastic is not, science and nature kind of publications. It's just getting it done engineering. So we really been doing one or two impossible things every year since this project started. We were told that we'd never get silicon in contact with blood because it would clot right away. We were told that if we made a gadget, it would never work because it would clot off right away. We were told we'd have to have lethal levels of anticoagulants to keep it going. We were told that cells break down after a couple weeks in culture. You'll never actually get anywhere. You said cells don't express their transporters when you grow them in a dish. So your project is doomed. Cells transporting fluid never happen. We've done all these things despite the naysayers with their Western blots and their wisdom. We've shown the fundamental components of a biohybrid universal donor kidney. It doesn't require warfarin. It doesn't require a patient to be connected to great big vats of dialysate. I didn't go into it, but it doesn't require anti-rejection medicines. It doesn't require catheters that pierce the skin and expose the patient to infection. We're getting there. So David Humes, who Kim Soles mentioned at the beginning of the talk, is a nephrologist at University of Michigan. He gave me a job and nobody else would give me the time of day. Really, I put my pack on my back and wandered the US looking for a nephrology fellowship, and I got laughed at everywhere. David probably chuckled to himself as well, but he gave me a job. Shuvo Roy and Aaron Fleischman are biomedical engineers then at the Cleveland Clinic, who put their shoulder to the wheel and started making chips long before I had my first dollar of support. Roger Marchant was a macromolecular chemist at Case. Andrew Zidney, I mentioned, is the chair of Chem-E at Penn State. Terry Conlisk was a mechanical engineer at Ohio State who helped us with some of the flow through membrane stuff. You'll notice that we've got a Wolverine, a Nittany Lion, and a Buckeye all collaborating on the same project. That may not have significance in Canada, but that's sort of a very well-known football rivalry between those three. We've been fortunate to have received NIH funding over the last 20 years. It's humiliating that it's such a short list, to be honest with you. And we've been dependent on gifts from families that have been touched by renal disease and have been appalled at the limited range of options that are available to them. Once we got successful and were showing some of the concepts that we were told were impossible, the nature of our grant reviews changed. So recently I got a grant review back that said the concept and work proposed on this project was initiated more than a decade ago with steady, slow progress over the last 10 years. Kim, can you imagine any warmer words in a grant proposal?
Yeah, pretty nice.
Oh, but therefore it's not transformative. It's not a paradigm shift. They've been at it for a while. No money. Another reviewer on the same grant said the approach is logical and milestones are stated clearly. The proposed approaches are based on a solid foundation. Alternatives are proposed. It's likely the team will make progress and accomplish much of what they proposed. Kim, have you ever had a grant review that said such warm words?
Yeah, but the last line is a killer. Yeah.
Yes. And then when they are actually challenged to produce some objective reason why, they said, well, we didn't explain how we were going to test the artificial kidney in male and female pigs and investigate the role of sex as a biological variable. Right? And so right now I have no grant funding. My project is on fumes. I'm dependent on the charity of families that have been affected by kidney disease. My last 6 NIH grants to develop implantable artificial kidney have not been funded. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm not the first person to be in this boat. Pim Kolff invented, or let me rephrase that. Dialysis has been around since Tom Graham in the 19th century. It's been accomplished in mammals since, I guess what, John Jacob Abel in 1906, Kim? Yep. Getting catecholamines out of a dog. But Kolff was the first physician to apply hemodialysis to a human patient in renal failure in the Netherlands in 1944. And he went on to make many advances. Some of you have heard of the Jarvik 7 artificial heart, the mechanical heart that was tested in an American dentist named Barney Clark. It was designed by Kolff. When he died a couple years ago, I guess a decade ago now, he was working on oxygenators. Over his entire life, he was working on the value of engineering to ameliorate human suffering. And he said it's nearly impossible to obtain funding for something simple. Over the years, my laboratory has teetered along, always on the rim of bankruptcy, always having too many ideas and too little money to carry them out. And that's my talk. I hope you liked it. Kim, if there's people in Edmonton who've got money, please give them my address.
Yeah. Well, you know, I wanted to tell you that in the last week, we have had a number of successes in areas where you would say you can never change that. That will never change. You can never change that. Nobody's going to listen. So you're thinking of, well, what new areas I'm talking about? I was tasked with writing an obituary for one of the most well-met people, but not a thought leader. So I thought, boy, I wonder how this is going to go. But he's the most memorable person you would meet at meetings. So, you know, I have a very large number of pictures, and so I came up with 9 pictures of this guy in different settings. We composed the obituary, sent it to the best journal in transplantation, and the editor said, well, you know, we never use more than 1 picture per obituary. So we began thinking how we're going to choose the one. But he said, here, I'll let the editorial staff deal with you from here on out. Well, they were so impressed with the pictures that they decided to use 8 out of 9 of them. So we suddenly had this guy's obituary without precedent. Nobody had ever had an obituary in a very good medical journal with this many pictures. Anyway, just one thing. Then I had an article about the concept of the symmetrical timeline. So both of these things were in the last week. Symmetrical timeline in renal medicine, going back to Richard Bright in 1827, 193 years, going forward 193 years, to the postulated point at which mind uploading is so successful and widespread that people don't need kidneys anymore because they're all going for the ceramic slab and digital consciousness, right? So how do you write about that? It's really an off-putting idea. If you put that idea in your article, it's gonna bring up people short, right? So what we did was put it in the abstract and put nothing about it in the article itself. That worked like a charm. People love rereading the article. They're not quite sure why, but it is because all the off-putting stuff isn't there, and they never reread the abstract. So anyway, in those two areas in the last week, we have changed something that seemed immutable. No one had the power to change that. No one had the power to publish an article that omits something from the article proper that's in the abstract. No one had the power to take a guy who's not a thought leader and give him one of the most successful obituaries ever. The family is ecstatic. Everybody who knows the guy, and this touched 75 lives. That's the number of people who are in those 8 pictures. So all I'm saying is, just as your science, you've come to a point where all these things people said were impossible. You've overcome all those barriers. Now it's the funding that needs to overcome the barriers. And I'm sure that is possible too. So I'm applying for a major leadership role here at absolutely the worst time. You know, it's like every future prediction is just absolutely terrible about where laboratory medicine in this province is going. So I would be the local leader at a time. Well, there are things similar to that and what David Humes was doing back in the early 90s. But I think with proper marketing, right? That's maybe what it is, that you can succeed and get people to support your ideas. So no, I think that this is exactly the talk we needed at this time, and I think the students probably found it very exciting in the sense of what can occur next. So, okay, students, what do you think?
So, Dr. Fissell, thanks so much. This was fascinating. I had no idea that someone was even working on trying to come up with an artificial organ that can fix a problem that I thought was better managed these days, but it seems that over 20 years, they seem to have missed how to innovate. So I'm happy that you exist and you're trying to get there. And this is also a little to see that trend changers have always had to fight for to get funds is a little not encouraging. But I wonder if you have considered teaming up with companies rather
Yes.
than looking into the NIH. And for instance, I know that stem cell technologies in British Columbia are doing research in organoids and 3D culturing, and it's different from what you're doing, but have you pitched the idea to companies like that?
Hundreds.
And still,
Yeah, so there's a duopoly in the dialysis space that harvests $60 billion a year out of the US economy by not innovating. The LVAD community taught I don't know if the other participants want to open up their video so I can see who I'm talking to. The LVAD community.
Stop sharing, and then we will all.
No, he has. Oh yeah, I guess that's right. You need to stop.
How about that?
There you go.
Sharing.
Yes.
All right.
Okay. Now
So,
we can fully
Is that a new
manifest
definition of oversharing?
humanity here. Yeah, now
Um,
you'll see the humanity.
So, well, no, because I still don't see Taryn or Nicole or Kaja. So the issue there is that the LVAD community, the mechanical circulatory support community, taught a lesson to the venture capital community. And so it was in the 1960s that the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, over the wishes of its reviewers and its staff, began to fund mechanical circulatory support engineering research. They said, in a prequel to what happens today in kidney disease, that they were going to understand myocardial infarction and render the need for treatment of heart failure irrelevant. Some 45 years later, LVADs are now standard of care for systolic dysfunction. But the amount of time that it took for a company like Thoratec to start to return capital to investors was 20 years. And if you can make your money back in 3 years on Farmville or TikTok, there's absolutely no reason to risk your money in a long-term venture where there's capitated reimbursement from the largest market, the United States, and there's significant competitive risk. If some guy at UAB makes a pig kidney that's not allergenic, you can just, Wilbur, come here, get your kidney, and a side of bacon while you're at it. That has the potential to render this project and the financial investment in it irrelevant. If in some dark future, the US government decides that it's not paying for dialysis anymore because $60 billion is a lot of money for really crummy outcomes, then there's reimbursement risk. So the final worry always is that investors change the governance as well. So I don't know if you know of a guy named Steve Ash. Steve Ash is an innovative nephrologist at Purdue University, and he's most known for his catheter designs, but he also developed a home hemodialysis machine based on sorbent technologies that only took a couple liters of water, so you didn't need a water treatment plant in your house. Very efficient, a lovely little machine. And he had a little company called Renal Solutions, or HemoCleanse, sorry. And the investors, he got it all the way through the FDA. It was approved for marketing in the United States as a treatment for renal failure. And the investors wanted to cash out. They sold the machine to Fresenius. Every single machine was the company to Fresenius. Every single machine was placed in a car crusher and has never been seen again. So we have learned that innocence is the first casualty of business, that we have been approached time and again by companies whose names you would recognize, dangling offers of money, fame, riches. I mean, these people have paid for me to fly all over the world to talk to them. And usually at the last moment at the altar, somebody runs away. And our intel suggests to us that all of this was a art form by which a mid-level manager could prepare a detailed technology landscape report for his or her manager, and there was never any serious intent on investing. We have spent months assisting companies with their due diligence and then been told, oh, well, we don't invest in technology companies. Well, what the hell did you think we were all along? So innocence really is the first casualty of business. We've yet to identify a strategic partner who we think has the interests of the technology and the interests of patients foremost, sadly. I would love for corporate investment. I am not going to be a manufacturer. I'm not going to sell gadgets. I'm not going to be invested in physician relations and marketing and distribution. But the partner hasn't come along. We were hoping that perhaps insurance companies who are becoming fatigued of squandering money on dialysis might back us. They have not stepped up. The threshold appears to be getting the technology into humans. And once that's there, we've been told that then the door will be open for investment. I suspect that, like Charlie Brown and Lucy, the football will be snatched away or the goalposts will be moved, and then we'll have to get a little bit further. So yes, we have been courting risk capital investment for the better part of 12 years. We have been misled, lied to, observed the magical appearance of blocking intellectual property in defiance of a non-disclosure agreement. And when we ask about this, we're told, well, we're a $6 billion company, you're you. What do you intend to do about it? That you would think that with a superior mousetrap, somebody would come along and want to make it and market it. That hasn't happened yet.
So I just wanted to point out this graphic. Now, I could introduce you to a famous person who made the graphic, Molly Little. Molly is in her early 20s. She's a graphic artist and animator from Calgary, the city to the south of us. And she made this graphic, which you would recognize as figure 3 from our Kidney International editorial that's in press. And that roller coaster like change in Google Trends for kidney disease is meaningful. It provides opportunities. It is a resetting. And actually in the area of laboratory medicine, where I'm taking on perhaps this major leadership role in absolutely the worst time in history, there's an even greater resetting, basically 50% up and down in terms of interest in the word diagnostics during the COVID pandemic. So a lot of things that were impossible before, the pandemic has kind of loosened up the resistance, and they are possible now. This includes digital pathology. I've been an advocate for the AI physician and digital pathology for about 20 years now, but it was kind of a pipe dream because you couldn't get anybody to change from the traditional microscope and glass slide. But now during the pandemic, people can see that this is the obvious way to go. So surprisingly, the pandemic is not bad for everything. And it does shake up the world in a way that could get people interested in your project, from a financial point of view and could move things quicker than you ever thought possible, where in a pre-pandemic world, maybe you were dead in the water in terms of funding. But I think in the intra-pandemic world and post-pandemic world, I don't think you will be. So that's what the editorial that you and I and a bunch of students wrote says, and it's true. And you would realize one other thing. Think about the effect of industry on you and me. So I got a communication about how we were going to handle access to that editorial. It has, you will realize, a much more appealing name than any article you've ever been associated with, right? Re-innovating nephrology, a call to action. Now, why isn't this an article that would interest every single person in kidney medicine? Well, that's exactly the intent of that title. So what happened? The form came where I could indicate that I wanted to pay for open access. And the very next day, I got this communication. Whoops, sorry, you weren't quick enough. And because we didn't hear from you, we proceeded to make this an article that people are going to have to pay for access to. So that has also happened to us. And I think it's kind of interesting. You can say, well, what a wonderful gift that the editors allowed us to provide a title to that article where everybody for the next 100 years in kidney medicine is going to want to see what that article says. But they also created a circumstance where most people are going to have to pay for that, except friends of mine who get reprints. So I ordered 200 reprints. Who gets reprints anymore?
Right. It's an old school thing. I have to bid you adieu. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you.
Certainly.
I hope that the incidents of closed head injuries from people falling asleep and their heads slapping the desk.
No, none of that. There was no risk of that. Yeah.
And we'll see. I look forward to seeing you in person as soon as possible.
Great. Okay, well,
care now.
thank you. And we'll do this again, Bill. We will. And the news will be more favorable the next time we do it.
I hope so.
guarantee you that.
Take care.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye. So we can still talk, the rest of you that are here. Do you have any questions for me about this? How did this seem to you? I can tell you that the Faculty of Science advisors have uniformly said that the previous version of this course, where it seemed like none of the presentations contained medical terms, was much too fluffy for them. So there had to be at least a few lectures, a few teaching sessions that used medical terms. So this was one of them. Did you find that terribly off-putting? What did you think? Yeah, okay.